February 1943. The North Atlantic lay cold and merciless, its waves swallowing the wreckage of yet another ship. The SS Laconia, a British troop transport, had just been struck by a German torpedo. Within minutes, the steel vessel split apart, and more than 2,000 people were thrown into the freezing sea. Among them were soldiers, civilians, and hundreds of Italian prisoners of war, men who only hours ago had been heading home. Now they screamed into the darkness, clinging to debris, their breaths turning to mist in the bitter wind. Far below, the submarine U-156 lingered in the depths. Inside, Korvettenkapitän Werner Hartenstein, commander of the U-boat, watched in silence. He had done his duty, another enemy ship destroyed. But what he saw next would change everything. Through his periscope, Hartenstein saw not soldiers, but families. He saw lifeboats overturning. He saw faces pale with terror, men begging not for victory, but for life. In that moment, the war's rules began to blur. Every order, every doctrine of survival told him to move on, to vanish beneath the waves before Allied aircraft arrived. But Hartenstein hesitated. Then he made a choice that defied logic, training, and the cruelty of war itself. He surfaced his submarine, and instead of finishing the job, he began saving his enemies. That night, the hunters became rescuers. German sailors pulled British survivors from the icy water, offered them blankets, food, even space on the deck of the very submarine that had destroyed their ship. What followed was one of the most extraordinary moments of World War II, an act of humanity in the middle of total war. But this act of mercy would lead to betrayal, tragedy, and a moment that changed naval warfare forever. The story begins months before that night in 1943. When the Atlantic Ocean was the deadliest battlefield on Earth, every ship that crossed its waters risked becoming a graveyard. By 1942, Britain was desperate. German U-boats had turned the Atlantic into what Churchill called the worst crisis of the war. Merchant convoys carried food, weapons, and soldiers to keep the British Isles alive. But beneath the waves, the Kriegsmarine's wolf packs hunted relentlessly, sinking hundreds of ships each month. These submarines weren't just machines of war, they were symbols of German precision and discipline. Inside them, life was cramped, air was foul, and every sound from above could mean death. Yet, for the men aboard, there was a sense of pride. They believed they were defending their homeland, striking blows that starved an empire. Among these men was Werner Hartenstein, commander of U-156. A professional officer, respected by his crew, calm under pressure, and loyal to his code. He had already earned the Iron Cross for his earlier patrols. But unlike many others, Hartenstein was not driven by hatred. Those who served under him remembered his decency. A man who treated even his enemies with a strange, quiet respect. In September 1942, the U-156 left its base in France under the command of Hartenstein. Its mission: patrol the South Atlantic and attack Allied shipping near the equator. For weeks, the submarine hunted, moving silently through the endless blue. Then, on September 12th, fate delivered the SS Laconia into its sights. The Laconia was no ordinary ship. Once a passenger liner, it had been converted into a troop transport. On board were over 2,700 people: British soldiers, civilians, and nearly 1,800 Italian prisoners of war captured in North Africa. The ship was heading from Cape Town toward the United Kingdom, escorted by no warships, unarmed and vulnerable. At 8:10 p.m., the U-boat's sonar detected a large target. The silhouette matched that of an Allied transport. Hartenstein ordered 2 torpedoes fired. Moments later, the explosions ripped through the hull of the Laconia. The ship began to list heavily, fires spreading across its decks. Panic followed. Lifeboats were lowered too fast. Some overturned. Hundreds were trapped inside as the ship began to sink. For the crew of the U-boat, it was another successful strike. They recorded the sinking, marked their position, and prepared to dive. But then the voices came. Distant cries carried across the water. In the dim light, they saw lifeboats and floating figures. At first, they assumed the survivors were Allied soldiers. Then Hartenstein learned that the ship had been carrying Italian prisoners, allies of Germany. The shock hit hard. He had unknowingly killed his own side's men. But even that didn't explain what he was about to do next. Instead of disappearing into the deep, Hartenstein surfaced and took a decision that no one expected. He would rescue as many people as he could. Enemy or ally, it didn't matter. By dawn, the scene had transformed. A German submarine stood still in the open ocean, its deck crowded with soaked, shivering survivors. More than 50 men were already aboard, and dozens more clung to ropes or makeshift rafts tied to the U-boat's hull. The crew distributed what little they had: food, blankets, water, rationed carefully among the wounded and terrified. Then Hartenstein did something even more extraordinary. He used his radio to broadcast an open message in English, German, and Italian. "If any ship will assist the survivors of the Laconia, I will not attack, providing I am not attacked by ship or aircraft." It was a message to friend and foe alike, a declaration of temporary peace in the middle of war. In those moments, the cold logic of battle gave way to something deeply human. But mercy, in war, comes with consequences. And soon, other submarines would join the rescue, followed by American bombers who saw only one thing: a German U-boat on the surface. For a few rare days in the middle of the war, the Atlantic turned into something almost sacred, a place where enemies worked together to save lives. Commander Werner Hartenstein's message had reached far beyond his submarine. It was picked up by other German U-boats operating nearby: U-506, U-507, and the Italian submarine Capellini. One by one, they changed course and joined the mission. By the evening of September 13th, the sea around the wreck of the Laconia was dotted with lifeboats, rafts, and 4-axis submarines, all of them engaged in rescue, not war. The U-boat decks were packed with survivors: British officers, Polish guards, Italian prisoners, women, and children. Some sat wrapped in blankets beside the very men who had sunk their ship. The air smelled of salt, oil, and wet rope. The crew of U-156 used the last of their rations and even opened their emergency stores. They shared cigarettes and water bottles with the British. Hartenstein personally tended to the wounded. Witnesses later recalled him helping an injured British nurse up the ladder, apologizing softly for what had happened. For that brief moment, the war seemed to pause. The men looked at each other not as enemies, but as humans trying to survive the same indifferent sea. But the situation was fragile. The submarines could not carry so many people for long. They were dangerously overloaded, unable to dive if attacked. The decks were lined with survivors, holding onto ropes and lifeboats tied together in clusters. If Allied aircraft spotted them, they would have no defense. Still, Hartenstein believed in the message he'd sent: that humanitarian rescue would be honored, even in wartime. He had contacted the Vichy French, Germany's collaborators, requesting they send surface ships to take over the survivors. The French agreed to dispatch the cruiser Gloire and 2 smaller vessels from Dakar. Until then, the submarines had to hold position. For 3 days, they waited. Every sunrise brought new hope and new danger. Then, on September 16, 1942, that hope was shattered. A U.S. Army B-24 Liberator bomber flying from Ascension Island spotted the submarines. Through its lens, the pilot saw a German U-boat on the surface, large, stationary, with lifeboats around it. But from above, mercy and menace looked the same. The pilot radioed back: "Enemy submarine sighted." The order came swiftly from the American base commander: "Attack immediately." Hartenstein saw the aircraft approaching. He ordered his men to raise a giant Red Cross flag, visible even from the sky. Survivors waved their arms, shouting, trying to signal that they were civilians. But none of it mattered. The bomber descended and released its first depth charges. The ocean erupted. The lifeboats splintered. Survivors thrown into the air, screaming. The deck of U-156 shook violently. One of the depth charges exploded close enough to damage the hull. Water rushed into the compartments below. In the chaos, Hartenstein gave the only order he could: "Cut the ropes. Dive!" The submarine began to submerge, leaving hundreds of people thrashing in the water. The crew was torn between duty and despair. Many had tears in their eyes as they watched those they had just saved disappear behind the waves. Hartenstein surfaced miles away to check for survivors, but the sea was empty. The rescue mission was over. What began as an act of compassion had ended in tragedy. The other submarines received the news and fled. The Vichy French ships continued toward the area, eventually rescuing a few hundred survivors. But more than 1,600 people, including many Italians, women, and children, had perished. The Laconia Incident, as it came to be known, sent shockwaves through both navies. When Admiral Karl Dönitz, head of the U-boat command, learned of it, his reaction was cold and furious. He issued a new directive, one that would shape the rest of the submarine war. Rescue attempts of enemy survivors are to cease forthwith. Rescue contradicts the basic demands of warfare for the destruction of enemy ships and crews. It became known as the Laconia Order, and it forbade all German submarines from ever helping survivors again. From that day, the Atlantic turned colder. The act of humanity shown by Hartenstein and his crew was buried under new rules of cruelty and fear. The men who had once pulled others from the sea were now ordered to leave them to die. Yet among those who survived the Laconia sinking, the memory of that brief mercy endured. They spoke of German sailors sharing blankets, of a commander who risked everything to save them, and of the strange, tragic irony that compassion itself had become a casualty of war. The Laconia incident had ended, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. In Berlin, the news reached the headquarters of the Kriegsmarine like a thunderclap. To some officers, Hartenstein's actions seemed noble, even chivalrous. To others, it was madness. They argued that by surfacing, he had endangered not only his crew, but also Germany's entire Atlantic campaign. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, faced a moral and strategic dilemma. He admired Hartenstein's discipline, but could not ignore the risk such mercy posed. The Americans had bombed a submarine that was visibly engaged in rescue operations. That single act proved that, in total war, even compassion could not survive. Dönitz's decision came swiftly and without emotion. He gathered his senior officers and dictated the Laconia Order, a decree that would define U-boat conduct for the rest of the war. No German submarine, he declared, would ever again attempt to save survivors from a sunken ship, enemy, ally, or civilian. The Atlantic, already deadly, became absolute in its cruelty. For Hartenstein, there was no time to reflect on his actions. His damaged submarine limped toward safety, still bearing the scars of the American attack. In those tight steel corridors, the atmosphere was heavy, not from fear, but from guilt. The crew who had shared food with British sailors now carried the weight of those same faces, lost beneath the waves. Several survivors later wrote of seeing the commander in silence for hours, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the sea. They said he spoke little, only that a man must do what is right, even when it is not rewarded. 5 months later, Hartenstein would embark on what would be his final patrol. In March 1943, while operating off the coast of West Africa, U-156 was spotted again, this time by an American aircraft from Ascension Island. The bomber swooped in, and before Hartenstein could dive, a series of depth charges exploded nearby. The U-boat broke apart, sending oil and debris across the surface. No one survived. Hartenstein and his crew vanished into the depths, claimed by the same ocean where they had once shown mercy. But the ripples of his actions did not end there. In the months that followed, Allied propaganda painted the incident as proof of German deception, claiming that the Red Cross flag had been a ruse. German command used the American attack to justify harsher orders and more ruthless tactics. Each side used the tragedy to fuel its own cause. And yet beneath those official narratives, there remained something far more human. A truth carried in the memories of those rescued. British survivors later gave sworn testimony about what had really happened. They described how German sailors had risked their own lives to save them, how they had been treated with dignity and kindness, One survivor, a nurse named Elizabeth Fullerton, said, "They gave us their own water and food. They were decent men, and I will never forget that." Another, Lieutenant Geoffrey Gwither, recalled how Hartenstein had apologized for sinking the ship, saying simply, "War makes beasts of us all, but perhaps not tonight." Those testimonies were quietly filed away, overshadowed by the greater violence of the war. But in small ways, they survived. In letters, in memoirs, in stories passed down through families. Meanwhile, in the post-war trials at Nuremberg, Dönitz's Laconia order became a point of fierce debate. Allied prosecutors accused him of violating the laws of war by forbidding rescue. Dönitz defended himself coldly, arguing that even the Americans had attacked a submarine engaged in saving lives. The irony was unbearable. One man punished for showing mercy, another excused for showing none. As historians looked back, the Laconia incident became more than a footnote. It became a mirror. It forced both sides to confront the reality that morality in war is not written in the rules of nations, but in the choices of individuals. Werner Hartenstein did not live to see how his actions would be remembered. He died as he had lived, at sea, between duty and conscience. But in that single act of compassion, he exposed something deeper than politics or uniforms. The fragile humanity that still flickers, even in the darkest depths of war. After the war, the oceans grew quiet again. Ships sailed freely where U-boats once hunted, and the world tried to move on. But among the men and women who survived the Laconia, the memory of that strange night never left. It lived on in whispers, of German sailors who risked their own safety to pull strangers from the sea, of a commander who had chosen conscience over command. For decades, official histories of the Battle of the Atlantic spoke mostly of tonnage sunk and convoys lost. The story of U-156 and its rescue mission remained buried beneath statistics. But as survivors aged, their testimonies began to surface. Letters, journals, and quiet recollections that revealed what the official reports had missed. They remembered the smell of diesel and wet rope on the U-boat's deck. They remembered the Germans offering them water, even tearing their own uniforms to make bandages. They remembered Hartenstein, tall, calm, speaking softly in broken English, assuring them that they were safe. To the survivors, he was not the face of the enemy. He was the face of decency, surviving where none should have. In the decades that followed, historians began to re-examine the Laconia incident not as a military blunder, but as a moment of moral courage. For a brief instant in a war defined by cruelty, the boundaries between friend and foe dissolved. The sea, that merciless expanse that swallowed thousands, had witnessed something profoundly human. And yet, the legacy of that compassion remained stained by what followed. The Laconia order hardened the Atlantic War. From that point on, both sides fought with absolute ruthlessness. Submarines stopped rescuing survivors. Ships fired on lifeboats, fearing ambush. The ocean became a graveyard, silent and impartial. Hartenstein's decision, once considered reckless, became an act of quiet defiance. One man's refusal to let duty erase humanity. His story reminds us that even in the machinery of total war, a single moral choice can echo louder than 1,000 orders. In 2002, a British diver discovered what was believed to be the wreck of the U-156, lying beneath the Atlantic sands off the coast of West Africa. No official plaque marks the site. No monument stands in his name. But in the accounts of those he saved, his legacy endures. One survivor wrote, "He was my enemy. But in those hours, he was the only man who saw me as human." That single line captures the truth the ocean still holds. That compassion, even when crushed by war, leaves ripples that never fade. The Laconia incident remains one of the most haunting paradoxes of World War II. A moment when mercy was met with bombs, when good intentions led to tragedy, and when the best of humanity briefly surfaced in the heart of its worst conflict. Long after the guns fell silent, the waves of the Atlantic still whispered their secret, that a German submarine once became a lifeboat, and that even in the darkest depths, light can still be found. In the silence that followed, the ocean remembered everything.